a question about whether we learn anything about the behavior or really anything at all about her species from this film. At one point, he's online looking up research articles and coming up with many, but I'm not sure the film ever tells us, and perhaps it's not its job to tell us whether or not he's discovering anything we didn't know from other observations. Or is he just giving us amazing images of things that were already known about the behavior of octopuses? Does anything new emerge from this?
In terms of what he shows, what we see on film, there isn't really anything per se that I can put my finger on that I would say is novel. I would say that seeing it all in one shot is pretty extraordinary. Again, going back to the art of making the art and science of making documentary films about wildlife. Still, all of the things that he observed, the octopus sort of more or less walking bipedally on the, on the floor of the ocean, clustering itself in shells, basically sort of adorning itself and maybe hiding out, sort of a form of camouflage not involving some bodily change. That's been observed too. So essentially all of these things have been observed, but they've never been observed, I think, continuously across, the probably dozens or perhaps hundreds of hours of video that he made in the case of one animal. So that's really highly unusual. I do give him a great deal of credit because by his words, by his narration, it is clear that he did sort of ingest quite a bit of what he did read and sort of went back to it and revisited it. But again, everything there we've seen in different circumstances, in different contexts, in different animals. So
Megan, Alex?
I agree. I don't think there was anything overly novel in terms of the biology or the behavior of the animal. I think the novelty was the way that it was told. It was a story between this one particular individual, and then we saw all these different characteristics that had been observed in octopuses before in one individual. I think the only thing that I was a little bit astounded by is that Craig was able to track this animal underwater, and I thought that was incredible. You hear about tracking of terrestrial animals, but I'd never even imagined that you would be able to track a cephalopod underwater.
Yeah, that was really impressive. And I think he had one advantage in addition to the idea that, of course, he took some inspiration from Kalahari trackers that he had spent some time with decades ago as a filmmaker in Africa. He also had the advantage of this sort of weird sort of kelp cul-de-sac, this little kelp forest that he had, which was neat. And it sort of constrained, in a sense, it was good pickings for the animal, probably. The animal could get what it wanted in the way of food in this place. There was no good reason to range too far, and they don't range all that far. But the tracking thing was intriguing because he could, of course, follow probably the remains of crabs. He could sort of, you do see, and you can even see this in the laboratory if you're working with octopus and you're tasked with cleaning up the bottom of your tanks every single day, which can get really tedious. There's a lot of junk that accumulates. You do get used to sort of observing notable sort of, for lack of a better term, middens, collections of remains. And in my case, in my laboratories, mostly crab. So you can sort of see these things, and that makes tracking easier. But I do give him a great deal of credit for using these little clues to kind of move through and find, with a great deal of success, find this female octopus every day he went out. So.
Megan, you want to add anything? Or?
Well, I'm more of a human behavior than octopus behavior expert, so it was all new to me. But I do think that the way he went about researching it was very much in line with what we know about how we explain these emotional experiences that we have. He went to the intellectual side of it and said, all right, I'm going to use my cognitive power to try to figure out what's going on here. And he was really trying to sort of explain these experiences he was having using the tools that he knew how to use. So it was really interesting to see his perseverance in sort of getting through that process.
Okay, interesting. So in the chat, some comments are coming up that on his Facebook page, he acknowledges that some of the novel things were identifying new species of fish, so not necessarily related to the octopus.
Right.
And another comment that maybe he didn't fully acknowledge what was known before and contextualizing his own experiences. So we've alluded to this a couple times now, the storyline. Whose story is this? Is this Craig Foster's story and the octopus just happens to be there? Is it her story that he gives voice to through his cameras? Is it both of theirs? Who is the film's protagonist, to your minds?
That's a great question. I think part of the interest of the film was that it isn't exactly clear. That it's presented as the story of the octopus, but really it's about him and it's through his lens. And there's a certain amount, and this always happens when we interact with animals, of us projecting our emotions onto them. And, you know, he really grapples with that. He talks about how he thinks about whether he should interfere with these different situations happening with the octopus. You can tell he's really sort of grappling with that. So I think that's part of what makes it interesting, is that often happens with animals, that because we have the microphone, it's the story through our lens. And so we have to kind of come to terms with that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the narrative is predominantly sort of his journey through this year of his life, and framed through the lens, of course, of his previous experience, and as I think Alex may have said, or somebody said earlier, his burnout, and being, you know, in a very sort of a delicate place, right, in a very fragile position in his life. So it's definitely framed primarily through his eyes, and he's sort of the protagonist. The octopus is sort of a co-protagonist, but she sort of weaves in as and hence the title, I guess, My Octopus Teacher, as sort of giving him an assist in a certain way, changing his frame of reference over that year in which he observed her. And the change in the frame of reference is sort of key to the story, I think, or key to it's the punchline, I guess, is what I got. So
Alex, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's definitely through his perspective, but I'm just trying to think what the movie would be like without Craig or without the octopus. And they both seem like really important. They both played really important roles in the film. The octopus, really helped Craig reconnect with nature, reconnect with himself, and even reconnect with his son. So without the octopus, I can't imagine what the film would be like. Maybe it would be another animal under the water that he'd connect with, but who knows how if it was a fish or a seal, who knows how the audience would react to that. I think what drew people towards this is it's an unexpected connection between a human and an octopus, and that's what made it go viral. And everyone wanted to learn more about these shellless, spineless creatures.
Yeah, I think
it gave new perspective to the animal.
That's right. I think the implicit part, and sometimes explicit aspect, which is very important, is this connection that he made with this otherwise seemingly implacable, you know, entity, this sort of, some people have said, alien on Earth, where you would think, you know, a connection would be, you know, far and few between, or very, very difficult, if not impossible. And yet there it is. And I've had, you know, personal experiences with individual octopuses that sort of resonated, and this brought to light again in my memory watching this movie. So yeah,
it's always a challenge when trying to represent animals through our own words to get it right, and we'll never really know what right is, of course, in many cases. How do you think he scores on that, in that regard, in terms of articulating his perceptions of her emotions or her physical state, or what she's thinking or trying to do? Did it ring true to you? Did he seem to go too far at some points? What was your sense about his interpretation of her to us?
What do you think, Alex?
I do think that certain sections were anthropomorphized, but that's difficult when it was it was Craig's journey with this octopus. So I think it's difficult when you are having this emotional connection not to be able to anthropomorphize, to think, to kind of assume what the octopus might be feeling. One specific thing, because the story surrounds this idea that the octopus has befriended Craig. I think from a biological point of view and more of a octopus behavior point of view, the majority of them aren't social creatures. They don't like interacting with members of their own species. So I think what's happened there is that there's a fear barrier that has been broken down. There's some sort of familiarity that has occurred between Craig and the octopus. I don't think it's that the octopus has recognize the facial features of Craig. They have very poor recognition skills, and they struggle to recognize individuals of their own species, and sometimes individuals of the opposite sex. So I think what's happened is that there's a fear barrier that's broken down. The octopus touches Craig, and some of them have a taste by touch sensation. So there's kind of this barrier that's broken down, and then there's gained familiarity from the octopus. And that has allowed for more of an intimate interaction between the octopus and Craig. Craig frames it as he's developed this very strong friendship with the octopus, which is beautiful in its own way. But I don't think that is exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that I always, my sort of ears perk up and I sort of, my spine straightens when I hear the term anthropomorphism or anthropomorphizing. And one of the reasons that happens is I feel that often when we invoke that term, or when a lot of people invoke that term, they're ready to sort of throw the baby entirely out with the bathwater. And here's, of course, our limitation. Well, on the one hand, we have folks like the great Tom Nagel warning us that it's very difficult. We can't get into the brain or the mindset of a bat. What is it like to be a bat, right? It's a classic paper. And we really don't know. We're not embodied as bats. So there's always that sort of limitation on us. But on the flip side, you know, we often, you know, connections are made between non-human animals and humans in different regards. We cannot read, of course, in the case of mammals, we can intuit, even if we haven't studied a particular mammal that well, we can intuit that they have a rich emotional life, right? And that as mammals, there's a continuity, an evolutionary continuity, that essentially emotions are emotions, and there are emotions, and you know, we know our dogs can feel, right? Some aspects of their lives are suffused with emotion. Well, when we get to octopus, what can we possibly say? Their blood is blue, they're cold-blooded. You know, their metabolism is different. They have brains that are entirely alien, except if you're a fruit fly researcher, then you would recognize that an octopus brain sort of looks like a fruit fly brain magnified 500 times. It wraps itself around their, you know, their esophagus, more or less. But we can't really make much of it. I mean, you know, if somebody were to ask me, do octopuses have emotions, or do they have a rich emotional life? Well, I wouldn't say no necessarily, but I couldn't tell you. And I probably won't be throughout the rest of my life. I'm sure I would be at odds to tell you whether that's true. But do I see reactions that look like they're suffused with something, you know, that seems tantamount to surprise, or tantamount to something visceral going on? Yeah, I've seen that from occasion, but I can't really assign a label that is sort of a familiar emotional label to it. So I can't really tell you. And emotions are, of course, an important part of the story of connectedness between a non-human animal and a human being. In their absence, you know, sort of, what do you have if you're really talking about a real bond, right? So.
Great, thanks. Megan, you want to jump in on this? We can go on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that I agree with all of that, and I think it's interesting for us as humans, as inherently social beings, to try and connect with animals that have varying levels of social behaviors that we as humans recognize, and you can see that really come through in the documentary. And the behaviors that the octopus, you know, when the octopus is touching him, that is a social behavior that he recognizes as a social behavior. Now, whether it's a social behavior for the octopus or not is what the octopus experts will tell us, but that is sort of how he is connecting with this animal. And it's really how we as humans, again, are situating ourselves with all these other animals. And even with animals like dogs and cats, we misinterpret their behavior all the time. And because we're projecting our human behaviors on them. Of course, there's also the flip side in that if we're feeling more socially connected to animals, we're more likely to advocate for them. And so that's always the sort of two sides of the coin with anthropomorphism is, what's sort of the good and the bad of it. And whether that changes when we're moving from an animal that lives in our home to an animal that's living in a wild environment.
And inevitably, I have to say, our thoughts and even sort of further forward in terms of what we actually receive in the way of sensory information, our percepts inevitably within a very short period of time, they're suffused with linguistic terms. They're suffused with these tokens that we call, sort of words, language. Language creeps in. You cannot avoid it, right? There are very few instances, save perhaps some descriptions by Oliver Sacks in some of his great writing, of people who don't, inject what their thoughts or something that occurs to with language. Most of us we're bound to that. So, in a way, it's sort of our prison when we sort of look at the rest of the world, and especially when we're trying to characterize non-human animals, some of whom, they're certainly not going to have something like natural language that we would define as such, although some in the lab, arguably, like Irene Pepperberg's Alex and other parrots, African grays, can pick up something that looks like the rudiments of language. They are the rudiments of language, but that's an unusual case. So we're at a kind of a disadvantage in a certain sense. We have to describe the world in these terms, right? That's how we engage with the world. But on the flip side, what we're engaging with is it's not linguistic. So it's very, very tough. And I struggle with this all the time. And that's another reason why anthropomorphism or anthropomorphizing kind of, whenever that's invoked, I sort of say, well, hold on just a second, be careful, about this on both sides. On the one hand, don't overdo, but on the other hand, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And don't assume it's necessarily a negative act, right? It doesn't have to be.
Right.
Let me ask one more question, then I'll turn to the chat questions. In many commentary on the film, I've seen so many comments, and they're almost always the same. I won't eat calamari again. The Washington Post chief film critic interviewed the film directors, and that was one of her utterances. Now, of course, the fried food calamari is typically from squid, but of course, squid and octopus are related animals. So the question then is, do you think this film has the potential for affecting food choices? It's not a topic Craig Foster ever brings up. We don't know if he consumes the same fish he takes pictures of during the day. We don't know if he consumes squid. He never brings it up, but people often will stop eating terrestrial animals, but then remain pescatarians, I guess on the assumption that it's still humane or they're less sentient. I'm not sure, in many, many reasons, but can this film affect food choices?
That's a great question. This is such an interesting and complex topic of how our perceptions of animals are just inextricably intertwined with how we think about food and why we choose to eat certain types of animals and why we don't. And I think it's a really highly individualized phenomenon. Lots of people have lots of different rationales that they use for where they draw the line. But more broadly, I do think the more connected you feel to a particular animal, it may impact your likelihood to eat them or eat another animal like them. I think, again, it's this case of bringing this species of animal closer to us, and the closer to us they are, then possibly the less likely we would be to want to eat them. But I think that really depends on how you individually situate your feelings about animals. I mean, lots of people feel close to cows and chickens and other kinds of animals that they eat. So it's really very individual.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I have to say, I did make something somewhat of an arbitrary choice. I'm by no means, I'm not a vegan. I'm not a vegetarian. My wife often chides me for that. She's a vegan. Um, but as soon as I started working with octopuses, I was a ardent sushi lover. I consumed all kinds of sushi. I simply stopped eating octopus of any kind, fried, raw, whatever. Well, it's in a certain sense an arbitrary choice. Are cows not conscious in some way? I mean, if you're making sort of the point that it has to do with some sort of line of sentience versus non-sentience, or being aware versus not being aware, well, I'm I'm a hypocrite if that's the case, and I would never certainly never make that argument. But I did make the individual choice of no longer eating this animal that I started to sort of study ardently.
And
Uh,
why was that? Can you say, was it specifically about?
uh, Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it may have to do with my very first encounter with an animal in a laboratory was at the Stazione Zoologica in Naples, in Napoli. And it was the very first day I had actually encountered common octopuses in a laboratory. And I stepped up to a tank where one of these octopuses was about to get a really nice live crab. A graduate student was standing on a step stool at the other end of the tank, about to drop the crab, and the octopus had seen it, was jetting toward the grad student and the crab, obviously game for a good meal. And then I came in and I'm standing at the corner. I made no noise. I suddenly appear on the other side, and the animal stopped, turned around very quickly, and made a beeline toward me, which I thought was, wow, that's intriguing. It took me over food, which was rather extraordinary, and then lifted itself out of the tank, lifted its mantle, the sort of head-like structure that contains the brain and the eyes and the viscera, and was 4 inches away from me, basically looking at me. We had a staring contest for about a half an hour, interrupted by 5 minute breaks or 3 minute breaks where the octopus had to go down and get some oxygen, but came up again to look at me, and then put one of its arms on my wrist and sort of held me in place, not aggressively, but whenever I tried to leave, would turn on its suckers. Well, the instant I had that interaction, that would always return to my memory when I was sort of making a choice at the local Japanese market as to what I was going to bring home for dinner on a given occasion. And so, yeah, it was sort of just weird. It was an odd, idiosyncratic choice, and I can't really explain it or justify it in any other way.
So your wife should take you to Farm Sanctuary for a weekend, and you could have that interaction with every animal, and you'll come home a vegan. So,
I absolutely, that'll be it.
Alex, do you want to weigh in on the food question, or we can go on to the chat?
My thoughts are very similar to what David and Megan have said. I think it's a very personal choice, and a lot of the time, it's people come to their own conclusions because of individual experiences that they've had. Since working with cuttlefish, I no longer eat cuttlefish for the same kind of reason that David described. I've had these personal experiences with the animals, and now I can't bring myself to ever order them. They're arbitrary choices. I also don't eat pigs because I've had personal experience with pigs, but I'm not saying that pigs are more sentient than a lamb, or
Right.
it's just these experiences that you have with the animal, and then you look at them differently, I guess. You no
Yeah.
longer look at them as food.
I think that's right. And in fact, I mean, our relationship does change over time. I mean, I've of course always been a softie when it comes to non-human species, but I worked when I was learning physiology, neurophysiology, I had to do survival surgeries in rats, which would involve, because we were doing sleep studies, it involved implanting electrodes, essentially transcranial electrodes. And, I had a couple of pilot animals where I had sort of perfected the surgery. And when the surgery was done, generally speaking, what happens is the animals get killed. They're sacrificed. That's it. They're done. Couldn't bring myself to do it. So I brought them home. I dremeled off. They had these little things. They looked like they had mohawks. They had these plastic encasements that contained the wiring for the electrodes. And I dremeled off the top of these things, brought them home, and they lived the rest of their days, with us, basically. That was it. So again, arbitrary decision, arbitrary choice. I think I'm an unusual scientist in that sense. I don't think any other physiologist who was working with me at the time was busy adopting their rats, their subjects. But
Well, good for you and your household, David. But Alex, your answer, it does really create this interesting question of what if you both did an experiment, which is to go bond with different kinds of animals over the course of a period of time, right? The lambs, the chickens at farm sanctuaries. What would happen, and what insights might that give us to how people relate to animals and food choices? But a number of you have mentioned research, and we do have a couple of questions about research. David, people are interested to know more about your research, but we have a very targeted question, which is that I'm sure our panelists know this, but many of the listeners may be surprised to know that octopuses are not considered animals under the Federal Animal Welfare Act. So they do not get the protection in research capacities under that act. And indeed, we have one of the biggest cephalopod research facilities in Massachusetts, the Marine Biological Laboratory. The Harvard Animal Law and Policy Clinic is trying to get them covered, at least for federally funded research. For the panelists, how does one appropriately, in any way, draw the line between who's in and who's out for federal protection under the Animal Welfare Act? And is there any justification for excluding octopuses? And does the film shed any light on this question? They're apparently becoming quite popular in terms of scientific research.
well, it may become a very very important question shortly, very pressing, because in fact, of course, for the past decade in Europe, they've more or less adopted the equivalent of something like IACUC standards, basically, humane treatment and standards for cephalopods all over Europe. This is the case. England, or UK, excuse me, preceded Europe, actually, was earlier, I believe, than Europe by
Yeah, I think we stand out. We're the
Yeah.
lone.
We're
major
alone.
country.
Individual universities and colleges are starting to make these choices by themselves. At Dartmouth, where I built a laboratory with Peter Tse in the Psychological and Brain Sciences department, we built a lab in an animal facility. And in fact, they were very, very adamant, and we did not object at all. They were adamant about applying sort of the same standards, or as close to the same standards as one might apply. And a lot of people might quibble about this. I know a lot of researchers who have their hackles up about applying such standards to an animal like an octopus. Nevertheless, though, it looks like at least some places are being left to their own devices in terms of deciding how they're going to go. And again, a place like Dartmouth has decided to go more in the direction of Europe. So,
But that's left to individual institutional choices. We don't have a federal law in the US. Is there any scientific justification for that? Or is this just a relic of the Animal Welfare Act's sort of origins with cats and dogs, and sort of focus on vertebrates and mammals, and just a failure to expand over time?
what would you say, Alex or Megan? Any thoughts on this?
Is there any reason to be less concerned about their need for protection? Maybe is another way to ask the question.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that shortly there might be movement, as David was saying, within the states as to where we're going with how, if we consider cephalopods sentient. We've got similar patterns in Australia where it's actually the institutions that are enforcing researchers that are working with cephalopods to submit an ethics application. We're not at the level that the EU is in at the moment. And I've actually just been consulting for UK government to review evidence of sentience in cephalopods because of Brexit. The UK is now removed from EU legislation and policy, so they found themselves in a position where cephalopods were no longer under that protection. Yeah. And so when we were considering whether cephalopods, we actually weren't just considering whether cephalopods were sentient, we were considering if decapod crustaceans were also sentient, not just for research, but for fishing industry. And
For
we
the non-scientists, Alex, can you explain what that would include?
For reviewing evidence, you mean, or the sentience?
No, the species that are included that you just mentioned.
Oh, sure. So, yeah, the cephalopods we were interested in are octopus, cuttlefish, and squid, and the crustaceans, the decapod crustaceans, are like your lobsters and your large claw crabs. Mainly, I guess, because there was still, since the UK were now under EU law, there was still a lot of questionable practices that were happening then within fishing industry, like declawing and nipping and stuff like that. So we actually developed a framework for evaluating the evidence of sentience based on criteria that have been developed for mammals, but we tweaked them a little bit because some of them just weren't relevant. Right. And they included things like possession of nociceptors, so the ability to feel, not to feel pain, but to what's the word? To I guess respond to pain. Possession of integrative brain regions, responses to anesthetics or motivational trade-offs between balancing threat or reward, self-protection behavior, associative learning that goes beyond habituation. So these are the kind of criteria that we looked for within all the literature that we could find on cephalopods and crustaceans. And then we ended up giving pragmatic recommendations to the UK to actually include them in, if you're working on them for research purposes, then an ethical application needs to be submitted. And then we made recommendations for how fishing industry should move forward and what practices should absolutely not continue.
Yeah, so this is important because, in fact, as somebody who's sort of investigated and tried to help further legitimize the scientific study of consciousness, or I should say, the biological basis for conscious processing in nervous systems, it's been a struggle to come up with criteria for that. Of course, it's tough enough studying awareness in any regard in certain populations of humans, populations usually that it involves some pathology, people who are in persistent vegetative states. But sentience has definitely become part of the evaluation process when we're trying to figure out how to treat animals. Do you anesthetize them? Do you do survival surgeries under certain very, very rigid conditions? Pain, the perception of pain is another issue. And of course, pain is very thorny because the public doesn't really understand that there are sort of two components to pain as a physiological response. There is, as Alex said, there's the nociception part. And when you're dealing with invertebrates, nociception is sort of easier to, it's not easy, but it's easier to investigate. You can say, hey, look, we've discovered receptors on the surface of the skin or wherever they might be. And that indicates that these animals are sensing something happening that may be a prelude to damage, right? Which is the most important part of nociception in terms of adaptation. But the other aspect is pain. And in the case of vertebrates, mammals in particular, pain is what you'd call a central process. It is in the brain. We used to say pain is in the brain, or little rhyme, but that's essentially right. And you can see that through certain pathologies that eliminate the perception of pain in certain human populations. You can see that in other regards, but pain is essentially something that you feel because your brain has assigned it in some way, shape, or form. And there are parts of the brain regions which are very much involved in this. When you get to the cephalopods, or in fact any invertebrate, it's practically a black box when it comes to talking about central processing of whatever that nociceptive signal is by the time it gets into the central part of the nervous system. So, but these are important criteria. And again, sentience, for some reason or other, whatever, it figures into how we treat animals. We've decided, at some point, that if animals are aware, if they have sentience in any regard, we need to treat them in this very particular kind of way. I don't want to spend any time justifying that. I think it's a good way to go, but I think there are a lot of people who would sort of ask, well, why did we choose sentience? Why is it sentience that's, and maybe because it's the commonality, it's the idea that it's the identification that we have. This is another being who's aware of the world or aware of what's going on. So anyway.
So an interesting follow-up question on that. You referred to the black box when it comes to invertebrates, if we understood you correctly. And the question is it a black box because we don't understand it, because it hasn't been studied, or because we can't communicate with those animals to confirm pain?
Yes, it's actually all of those, I would say. I mean, without reservation, I would say all of those figure in. It's very difficult to sort of study these nervous systems. The physiology is in the kind of detail that we've managed to work out in the case of mammals and some other vertebrates, including birds. Well, that's incredible. And we've gone a long ways. When it comes to invertebrates and cephalopods, of course, in particular, we're at a very early stage. We don't have a way to record from those nervous systems with any degree of sophistication that we have in the case of the vertebrates. We don't even have so-called functional imaging techniques that allow us to see behaving brains in invertebrates in the same way that we see them in the vertebrates, for a variety of reasons. In the case of the octopus, when you do something called functional MRI, the signal isn't really based on nerve cells firing. It's actually based on the metabolism of those nerve cells. It's based on how much oxygen and glucose those nerve cells are using. Well, in cold-blooded animals that have, they don't have, it's not hemoglobin, it's hemocyanin, it's copper-based blood in the case of cephalopods. We don't have the physics. We don't understand the physics behind that yet to develop a functional imaging system that works the way, say, fMRI works for mammals. So we can watch what's going on in some animals' brains in the vertebrate case. We can't really do that so easily in the case of invertebrates yet. We're really far behind when it comes.
So then for all three of you, if that's the case, as you presented it, is it not incumbent upon humans to take the most conservative position, that is the position most protective of the animal, and that is an if humans are to conduct potentially harmful, painful experiments on them?
That's normally how research in sentience moves forward. So while in other disciplines we require the strongest evidence, where we have to tease out other explanations that could be causing the behavior that we're seeing, when it comes to sentience, we always err on the side of caution to minimize any particular fear, pain, or stress that the animal might be feeling. I do think the tide is changing, and even though we're not there yet with the equipment to be able to get the finer grained details that we might see in a vertebrate brain, there are being some experiments that have been adapted that have been used in the vertebrate world and adapted to see whether invertebrate animals respond in a similar way. So there's some research coming out of San Francisco in the Crook Lab, actually, where Robin did an excellent experiment on octopus to show that if they are injured with a bit of acid on their skin, they show self-protective behaviors the way that a mammal might, and they also value local anesthetics that are given to them in a particular room, and they'll go to that room if they've been injured. So she was able to provide the same type of behavioral evidence that we look for, say, in a vertebrate animal in the octopus. Mm-hmm. And so I think, yes, we're at the very beginning, but we are looking for converging evidence so that we can change the way we might use these animals to minimize ethical concerns or welfare risks.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need them at all? Do we need to use them at all? What's the justification, or why are they attractive to researchers?
Well, this is really, really tricky. This is something that any thinking scientist who's spent a great deal of time with not just one species of animal, but a number of different species, we always grapple with this. Because, there's always this sort of quest for knowledge. Of course, we sometimes idealize this in the public sphere, scientists looking for knowledge for its own sake, accruing knowledge for its own sake. That seems like thin justification in many ways to some people. One of the most intriguing parts of my sort of journey has been my view my coming to this as sort of somebody steeped in evolution and looking at octopus as this absolute, or cephalopods in general, as this absolutely miraculous, convergent line in the sense of different sensory systems. Vision is the most predominant one. I mean, the one I think about all the time. They have a focusing lens. They do have pretty darn good vision. As invertebrates go, they have really good vision. Arguably the best vision in terms of a focused image in the invertebrate world. Now, is it as good as sort of an eagle in terms of resolution? No, probably not. But it's pretty darn good. And so what I'm intrigued by is how this has informed the development of a different kind of intelligence. And sensation is always, of course, intimately related to intelligence. You're not going to evolve, rich intelligence in the absence of, rich sensory input. You kind of need that. And vision is one of the gateways. It's really important. And octopuses, as it happens, have pretty good vision as invertebrates go. So for me, that's a very fundamental question, but I don't know, and I can't answer your question as to whether that's sufficient. Is that sufficient justification to put these animals through whatever we're going to put them through? Well, behaviorally, we can do all kinds of behaviors that are non-invasive. It's non-invasive research. It's going to tell you an awful lot, but there's always going to be something about the nervous system and something about the physiology that we may not know and we may not understand. And at that point, we'd have to ask ourselves, well, what is the value of that knowledge? Does it have practical value? I'm not sure I can say yes or no. Early on, the investigation of squid nervous systems netted essentially a Nobel Prize. They allowed us to understand how synapses work for the first time at a very sort of basal level, starting in 1939. It was rather remarkable work. And without it, we wouldn't have been able to sort of go very far in terms of even practical applications in neuroscience. This was fundamental. And here's the deal. In 1939, Hodgkins, Huxley, and J.Z. Young, who developed the actual techniques in the laboratory to do this stuff, if you had asked them then, they wouldn't have been able to put their finger on exactly all of the practical applications that would, spin out of this 40, 50, 60 years later. That's the nature of scientific research. There's always the stuff that you can never anticipate. It may start as a very basic question you're answering, but somewhere down the road, decades down the road, it may dovetail into something incredibly practical, perhaps even right to the bedside of a patient. And you just don't know. So.
Thanks. And Steve Naimi has given us a TED Talk to take a look at in the chat. So in addition to these sentience questions, there have been a lot of questions about intelligence. And of course, oftentimes in the animal rights, animal welfare literature, sentience is one thing, but the higher order intelligence is something that some often see as a precursor or a necessary condition for rights. We can't get into that discussion today, but it would be interesting, maybe as the closing question, to hear your thoughts about intelligence. And at one point, Craig Foster compares her to a dog, if I'm recalling correctly, in terms of her intelligence level. Do you remember what
Yes.
He compares her to? And so that seems important. Of course, we know pigs are probably as intelligent, if not more intelligent, as dogs, but one is food, one is friend. Can you tell us a little bit about in some minds, not in all minds, of course, pigs are not food, but can you tell us a little bit about the intelligence of an octopus?
Oh, do you want to go, David?
No, Alex, go ahead.
Okay.
As a cat and a dog. Someone's telling us who remembers the line, intelligent as a cat and a dog. So Megan,
I'm not sure what comparisons Craig was making there and what he was referring to specifically in terms of comparing the octopus to a cat and a dog. I think we're at the very beginning of really understanding the extent or limits of cephalopod intelligence, including octopus intelligence. Back in the 1940s, there were a lot of experiments done that were very much focused on associative learning and conditioning, and they found that octopuses were really great learners. They could learn through various associative mechanisms. And by that, I mean they could learn different patterns that say X might equal Y. Swimming up to this particular visual cue might end in getting a crab. And those learnt patterns could then be applied and applied and applied. Now, when speaking to a comparative psychologist, we don't consider those sorts of learning mechanisms to be under the umbrella term of intelligence. Associative learning is prevalent across all different types of animals. But what we are trying to look at now is we're actually adapting paradigms that might be used to look at chimpanzee, elephant, crow intelligence to see if cuttlefish or octopus have similar cognitive capacities. And we are finding evidence of similar cognitive features, which is fascinating because these animals diverged from the vertebrate lineage over 550 million years ago. So that is really interesting. But I don't think we're at the stage where we can compare. We can't say, oh, an octopus is as smart as a dog or an octopus is as smart as a crow, because we're at the very beginning. So those studies that I'm talking about, there might be one study showing that a cuttlefish has a particular type of complex memory that we've only thought was found in chimpanzees and crows, but it's only one study, whereas you'll find 10, 12, 11, studies of those in crows where we investigate, well, how complex is this capacity? How complex is it this particular type of intelligence that we're seeing in this animal? And so while we're identifying that certain features are present in octopus or cuttlefish, we haven't gotten to the stage where we can talk about the level of complexity and therefore make these comparisons. But we're getting there. I think people are really interested in using cuttlefish and octopus as candidates for these experiments because they are quite willing to interact with experimenters and a lot of things that you put in their tank. And then also because of the ecological things that we're seeing. And that's where a lot of these ideas stem from. We're seeing these patterns in the environment, and then we're wondering, well, how are they driving these behaviors? Are they really driven by a type of intelligence that we might see in these other large brain vertebrates? And then we can apply those experiments to investigate the underlying mechanisms that might be driving the behaviors that we're seeing.
Ultimately, I think, dovetailing on what Alex just said, you have to, and this is again, my inner evolutionary biologist speaking here too, you have to look at the ecological context in which these animals emerged and evolved over time and say, well, let's try to reckon with the complexity of the environment for one thing, and then sort of see what kinds of problems the animal has to sort of solve in the wild. Now, there's a big gulf often between the kinds of experiments we design in laboratories and the kind of experiments we deploy in the wild, as the late Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, her husband, could tell you, from their studies of vervet monkeys. They tried to sort of bash down that wall back starting in the in the 70s, studying vervet monkeys in Africa, and came up with these wonderful playback experiments, which were sort of akin to the kind of thing that you might design if you were studying social animals in a laboratory, but they were able to import it into the wild. That's very rare. But we have to reckon with complexity in the wild. We have to reckon sort of with complexity in the nervous system as well, and how these two things mesh. But always with the caveat that certain things sort of defy expectation. So in the case of honeybees, there's been a tremendous amount of research on, for lack of a better term for it, honeybee cognition, and some amazing work that has demonstrated that honeybees are even capable of doing transitive sorts of associations. They can transfer one thing, sort of one aspect of learning, to some other context, which is really rather remarkable because this is an animal with basically more or less 1 million nerve cells, 1 million neurons, as opposed to 86 billion in the human being and 200 million between the eyes of an octopus, not counting the other 300 million in the arms. So this is incredibly sort of difficult to reckon with. You're sort of reckoning with the complexity of the environment, the complexity of course, the behavior to sort of survive in that environment, and what's going on internally. And you do have to sort of weave these things together. Now, I think we have a long ways to go, fortunately, and I might either be dead or be a very old man by the time we develop physiological techniques that are sophisticated in an animal like an octopus as they are in the case of mammals. But there's still tons, as Alex can attest to, there's tons of behavioral work to be done in invertebrates and in particular in the cephalopods. And as Alex said, the nice thing is you can use some of the game plans, some of the kinds of designs that have already been deployed in vertebrates, in the vertebrates.
Great. So we are at time. Megan, do you want to add in a last comment before we sign off?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a really interesting conversation. And what it makes me think of is sort of how and why we use intelligence as this way of comparing ourselves to other animals. I found it really interesting that he compared the octopus to a cat or a dog, because that's sort of this frame of reference. And we place a really high value on intelligence as humans, and that impacts the ethical frameworks that we use to interpret some of the science. And, you know, I think as scientists, we're obviously really committed to the science and moving it forward, but we also have to recognize that there are lots of different ethical frameworks that people use to interpret this science and to situate themselves within this larger context. So, you know, it's all these different pieces coming together. And I think one of the reasons this film resonated for a lot of people is because it highlighted some of these challenging points that we're still grappling with as our knowledge evolves. And that is interesting to us, these ways in which we're different.
Yes, and the human reference, right, to intelligence. And one thing I think he did a little bit of and would have loved to see more is acknowledging the times when she could do things that no human could possibly do.
Right.
The shape shifting and all these amazing characteristics, and hearing more about that would be great, right? Just to remind ourselves that there's so many amazing skills out there that we don't have.
Just one quick note. I'm sorry, I don't mean to sort of break the chain here very quickly. Irene Pepperberg in the comments mentioned a recent paper by Nikki Clayton on delayed gratification.
Yes, thank
cuttlefish,
you.
which is really remarkable in itself. And it's something, again, one of these little areas that we don't really think much about, but it's quite important. The idea that an animal can kind of inhibit or basically sit back and monitor and perhaps gauge the level of reward, gauge whether there is going to be a reward, basically not do anything. In other words, defy the classical expectation in an animal that might have been considered sort of very primitive along the evolutionary line, the expectation of reflex, the classic reflex arc, which is kind of sort of silly these days. But this is just the opposite. The idea that an animal can kind of inhibit, that a nervous system is capable of inhibiting an immediate response. The situation is monitored, and this is where I come in, with my work on visual perception in octopus. I'm really interested in this because the idea that they can sort of watch things from afar happen and unfold and not react quickly is remarkable in itself. And it's something that bears more scrutiny, I think. So sorry.
Yeah, we were really surprised actually with those results as well, because they were comparable to what you see in some large brain vertebrates, which was unexpected.
Yeah.
And they were able to use the self-control flexibly as well, so in different contexts. So it wasn't that we had trained them up to just delay gratification in any scenario. When there was a chance that they were going to get the better option, then they would exert self-control. When there was a chance that they would never get the better option, they just went for the immediate option. So it was a flexible behavior, which was pretty astounding. Yeah,
absolutely.
So before I sign off, Kim or Al, you might, if you can, save the chat. There's been some good literature posted in it. If you can save it, you might.
Yes, I will definitely say.
You might post that on your website for people to circle back around later. But thank you so much, Megan, David, Alex. Thanks for all the great questions. This is a very exciting conversation that could go on, but my job as moderator is to stay on time. I failed by 6 minutes, but I hope you all have a good evening or morning, depending on where you are. And thanks again to MBB for having this wonderful idea.